You know the feeling. Someone says something small, almost nothing, and your stomach drops before your brain even catches up. You apologize for things you didn't do. You agree to plans you never wanted and only realize it an hour later, staring at the wall, wondering how you got talked into it again. You feel guilty for being tired. You feel guilty for having a boundary. You feel a little crazy for remembering a conversation exactly the way it happened, only to be told, calmly and confidently, that it never happened that way at all. Why does one person's disappointment feel more urgent than your own exhaustion? Why do you replay arguments for days afterward, hunting for the moment you did something wrong, when the truth might be that you didn't do anything wrong at all? For a long time, the easy explanation was that you're too sensitive, too accommodating, too easily shaken, too quick to feel guilty, not thick-skinned enough for the real world. That explanation is comfortable because it puts the problem inside you, where you can supposedly fix it by trying harder. The psychologist George Simon spent decades working with people caught in exactly this fog, studying the individuals on the other side of these interactions. And his conclusion cuts against the comfortable story. Many of these moments are not accidents of personality. They are techniques learned, repeatable, and often deployed by people who don't even consciously register that they're doing it anymore, because the pattern has become instinct. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through the mechanics of everyday manipulation, the specific, almost invisible moves that shape decisions, extract guilt, and quietly rewrite what actually happened. By the end, you'll have language for things you felt for years but never had words for. And once you have the language, you'll start noticing the pattern everywhere, sometimes in others, and sometimes, uncomfortably, in yourself. Here is the first thing to understand, and it reorganizes everything that follows. Manipulation is rarely loud. The cultural image of a manipulator is someone cold, calculating, obviously cruel, a villain you'd spot in a room, someone whose intentions announce themselves. In practice, the people who are most effective at controlling others tend to be the opposite. They are warm. They are likable. They are, very often, the person everyone else describes as charming, the one who remembers your birthday and compliments your work in front of the group. Simon's framework centers on what he called covert aggression, the pursuit of control, while maintaining a surface appearance of reasonableness, even innocence. The aggression is real. The person genuinely wants to win, to get their way, to avoid accountability. But the aggression is disguised, wrapped in tones of hurt feelings, concern, or logic, so that the target ends up doing the emotional labor of managing the manipulator's reaction instead of addressing their own needs. The target leaves the interaction exhausted, and the manipulator leaves it having gotten exactly what they wanted, all while appearing to have done nothing at all. Picture two co-workers. One raises a legitimate concern about a missed deadline, directly, in a meeting. The room tenses immediately. People read directness as aggression, even when it's accurate and calm, even when it's delivered without a hint of anger. The other co-worker, the one who actually caused the missed deadline, responds not with facts, but with a wounded, quiet sigh. A comment about how hard they've been working. How unfair it feels to be singled out in front of everyone. Within minutes, the room's sympathy has shifted. The direct person looks like the problem. The evasive person looks like the victim. Nothing about the deadline changed. Only the emotional temperature did, and that shift was the entire point. You may recognize yourself in the first coworker more than you'd like. The person who says the true thing plainly and ends up apologizing for it by the end of the day, while the person who caused the actual issue walks away untouched, maybe even praised for how gracefully they handled the pressure. This pattern extends far beyond offices. It shows up at family dinners, where the person who brings up an old hurt calmly is labeled as dragging up the past, while the person who caused the hurt gets to play the reasonable one simply by staying composed. It shows up in friendships, where one person's tears in an argument functions as a full stop on the conversation, regardless of who was actually at fault. Tone becomes evidence. Composure becomes proof of innocence. Neither one actually is. This is where we're headed next, because once you understand that manipulation hides inside emotional reactions rather than facts, you start to see how guilt itself becomes a tool, wielded with precision. There's a version of this that shows up in negotiation of almost any kind, not just conflict. Someone frames a request so that disagreeing with them requires you to look unreasonable rather than simply different. Ask for a raise, and the response isn't a number, it's a comment about loyalty, about how the team is counting on you, about how asking right now of all times feels almost inconsiderate. The actual math of what you're worth never enters the conversation. The conversation becomes about your character instead, and that substitution is never an accident. If covert aggression is the strategy, guilt is one of its favorite instruments. Not guilt in the sense of genuine remorse for something you did, guilt manufactured on the spot, aimed at a target who did nothing wrong, deployed because it works faster than an actual argument, and leaves no fingerprints. Consider the sigh that arrives exactly when you set a boundary. You say you can't help this weekend. No words of protest follow, just a long pause, a flatter tone for the rest of the conversation, maybe a comment days later, almost offhand, about how some people just aren't reliable. Nothing was technically said against you. And yet you spend the next 3 days rehearsing justifications for a decision you were completely entitled to make, drafting apologies in your head for a boundary that needed no apology at all. Simon described this family of tactics: the guilt trip, the martyred sigh, the pointed silence, the sudden and mysterious withdrawal of warmth, as tools that work specifically because they bypass logic and go straight for the target's sense of themselves as a good person. You cannot argue your way out of a feeling. If someone convinces you that setting a boundary makes you selfish, you'll abandon boundaries far faster than any direct argument could ever convince you to. Because now the boundary itself feels like evidence of a character flaw. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it matters more than almost anything else in this video. If you recognize yourself constantly apologizing, constantly managing someone else's emotional weather, constantly feeling responsible for feelings you didn't cause, that is not a character flaw. It is very often a learned survival strategy, something you built, probably early, in an environment where someone else's mood was the most dangerous variable in the room. And staying safe meant staying alert to it before it exploded. What looks like oversensitivity from the outside is frequently a highly tuned threat detection system that once kept you safe. It is an adaptation, not a defect, a skill your younger self built out of necessity, now firing in situations where it may no longer be needed. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Now consider the paired contrast, because this pattern shows up in two opposite-looking people who are actually solving the same underlying problem. One person becomes the constant apologizer, quick to smooth things over, quick to take blame, desperate to avoid conflict at any cost, saying sorry before anyone has even finished their sentence. The other becomes the person who never apologizes at all, who meets every accusation with a counter-accusation, who has never once, in living memory, said the words "I was wrong" without immediately attaching a justification. Both are organized entirely around the same fear, being blamed. One surrenders to it constantly. The other refuses to let it land, ever, deflecting it back outward before it can settle. Neither is actually processing whether the blame is accurate in that specific moment. You may find yourself somewhere on that spectrum, and it's worth asking honestly which end you lean toward, and in which relationships. There's a manipulation tactic that hides inside something that looks, on its surface, like kindness reciprocity. Human beings are wired to feel obligated after receiving something, even something small, even something unrequested. It's a useful social instinct most of the time, the glue that holds communities and friendships together. It's also, unfortunately, exploitable by anyone willing to use it deliberately. Someone does you a favor you didn't ask for, covers a shift, buys you something small, goes out of their way in some visible manner, makes sure you notice the effort. Weeks later, when they ask for something disproportionate, your time, your money, your silence, about something they did wrong, that earlier favor resurfaces as leverage. Not stated outright, usually, just implied. In the phrasing, in the tone, after everything I've done for you. The original favor may have been genuine, but it has now been converted into a debt you never agreed to take on, and refusing the request feels, somehow, like defaulting on a loan you didn't know you'd signed. Simon's clinical observation was that manipulators who use this tactic rely on the target's own sense of fairness against them. A person with a strong internal sense of obligation is, ironically, easier to manipulate than a person with a weaker one. Because the manipulator doesn't have to force anything, they only have to activate a rule the target already believes in and lets steer their behavior. That's what makes this tactic so hard to spot from the inside. You're not being tricked by a stranger's logic. You're being maneuvered by your own values, pointed in a direction you didn't choose, using a compass you built yourself. You may notice this most clearly in retrospect, walking away from a conversation having agreed to something large, and only later reconstructing that the agreement was preceded by a small, seemingly unrelated favor offered days or weeks earlier, almost like a down payment made specifically so it could be collected on later. Which brings us to a related pressure tactic, one that doesn't rely on past debts at all, but on manufactured urgency in the present moment. Decisions made quickly are decisions made with less scrutiny. Manipulators, and it's worth saying plenty of ordinary salespeople and institutions who've simply learned what works, understand this instinctively, which is why so much pressure gets applied in the form of artificial deadlines. Decide now. This offer won't last. If you really cared, you'd already know the answer without needing time to think it over. In relationships specifically, this shows up as ultimatums delivered in moments chosen for maximum emotional weight late at night, right before you leave for a trip, in the middle of an unrelated argument that started over something else entirely. The urgency itself is the tactic. A person confident in their position rarely needs you to decide in the next 90 seconds. Manufactured urgency exists specifically to prevent you from consulting the version of yourself that thinks clearly, the version that would ask questions, take a walk, sleep on it, call a friend and say the situation out loud to someone outside it. Here's a useful hypothetical. Two people ask you for the same commitment, say, moving in together sooner than you'd planned. One raises it calmly over dinner, invites your questions, is comfortable if you say you need a week to think it over properly. The other raises it during a tense moment, frames your hesitation as proof you don't really love them, and treats any request for time as a rejection in disguise, as if wanting to think is itself the betrayal. The commitment being asked for is identical in both cases. Only the amount of room you're given to think is different, and that missing room is the whole tactic, the entire mechanism by which a bad decision gets smuggled past your better judgment. The instinct to slow down when you feel rushed is not paranoia. It is, very often, exactly the right instinct, arriving right on schedule, and it deserves to be trusted rather than talked out of. There's a quieter cousin of manufactured urgency. And it works through scarcity rather than speed, the sense that something or someone is rare, limited, about to be taken away, and therefore worth more than it would otherwise be. This is the mechanism behind a familiar dynamic. The person who pulls away right when you start to feel secure, then returns with just enough warmth to reset the whole cycle. The unpredictability isn't a flaw in the relationship. For some people, it is the relationship's entire operating system, because scarcity manufactures longing far more reliably than consistency does. You feel it as a kind of hunger that consistency never quite triggers. When someone is reliably warm, you settle into it and stop paying close attention. When warmth arrives unpredictably, you stay alert, hoping, working for it, mistaking the anxious pull of intermittent reward for the deeper pull of genuine connection. Simon's observations of controlling personalities noted that withdrawal, used this way, functions less like a natural mood and more like a lever pulled deliberately, released deliberately, calibrated to keep the other person reaching rather than resting. Consider the paired contrast again. One partner offers steady, unremarkable affection, the same warmth on a Tuesday as on an anniversary. It can feel, at first, almost boring, because nothing about it demands your vigilance. The other offers affection in bursts, surrounded by long stretches of coolness, and those bursts feel electric precisely because they're rare. It is worth asking, honestly, which one you've mistaken for passion at some point in your life, and whether what felt like chemistry was actually just your nervous system responding to scarcity the way it's built to. None of this means every quiet person is playing a game, or that every up and down relationship is calculated. Some people are simply inconsistent without any strategy behind it at all. But it's worth noticing where the unpredictability seems to serve someone's interests just a little too conveniently, and where it doesn't. The tactic most people find hardest to name, because it attacks the very tool you'd use to name it, is the deliberate distortion of shared reality commonly called gaslighting, though the underlying mechanism is older and simpler than the term suggests. It works by contesting not your opinions, but your memory of events, until you start doubting your own perception rather than the other person's account of what took place. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic lie. It arrives in small denials, repeated, patiently, over months. That's not what I said. You're remembering it wrong. You always exaggerate things. I never raised my voice. You must have imagined it. Each individual denial is survivable on its own. You can shrug off one instance of someone misremembering a conversation. Everyone does that occasionally. It's the accumulation that does the damage. After the 40th small correction to your memory, you stop trusting your own recall by default, and you start outsourcing your sense of what's real to the person doing the distorting, because it's simply less exhausting than fighting for your version every single time. Simon's work with individuals who use this pattern found something worth sitting with. The goal usually isn't confusion for its own sake. Confusion is a byproduct. The actual goal is control, because a person who no longer fully trusts their own memory of events becomes far easier to redirect, far easier to convince that any conflict must somehow be their fault, since they can no longer be certain what actually happened in the first place. If you've ever caught yourself keeping mental notes of conversations, or texting yourself a timestamp right after an argument so you'd have proof later, that instinct wasn't excessive or paranoid. It was your mind trying to protect a version of reality it correctly sensed was under attack, building evidence for a case it hoped it would never need to make. Here's the part that matters most, and it's the reason all of this is worth sitting through. None of these tactics survive being named out loud. Covert aggression depends on staying covert. Guilt trips depend on you not recognizing them as trips. Manufactured urgency depends on you not noticing the manufacturing. The moment you can say, calmly, even just to yourself, this is a guilt trip, this is manufactured urgency. This is a small rewrite of what actually happened. The tactic loses most of its power over you. Not because the other person stops trying, but because you stop mistaking their strategy for your own failing form. This doesn't mean every disagreement is manipulation, and it's worth being honest about that distinction. People misremember things innocently, all the time, without any agenda at all. People get defensive without malice, simply because being criticized is uncomfortable for almost everyone. People ask for urgency because circumstances are genuinely urgent, and not every ultimatum is a tactic. The distinction isn't about a single moment, it's about pattern, repeated over time, across many different situations. Does this person's account of events consistently, conveniently favor them, every single time, in every disagreement? Does urgency show up specifically around the requests that benefit them most, and never around the ones that don't? Does your guilt seem to arrive on command, timed almost perfectly to whatever they happen to need from you in that exact moment? One instance is a conversation. A pattern, repeated enough times to notice, is a strategy. And if you find, honestly, sitting with all of this, that some of it describes something in you, a habit of guilt tripping, of rewriting an argument in your own favor after the fact, of applying pressure when you don't get your way immediately, that recognition is worth something too, maybe even more. These patterns are learned, almost always somewhere far earlier than you'd expect, in rooms and relationships you didn't choose to be in. What's learned can be unlearned, but only once it's been seen clearly, without the comfortable fog of not knowing, without the easier story that lets it stay invisible. You don't owe anyone your discomfort just because they're skilled at generating it in you. You don't owe a debt you never agreed to. You don't owe a decision made faster than you're ready to make it. And you don't have to doubt your own memory just because someone else is more confident, or louder, or calmer in insisting on theirs. None of this requires you to become suspicious of everyone, or to treat every relationship like a negotiation with a hidden agenda. Most people, most of the time, are simply trying to get through their day without much strategy behind any of it. What this does require is a kind of attention you may not have practiced before noticing not just what someone says, but what a pattern of their words and timing tends to cost you, over and over, across weeks and months, rather than single conversations. The next time your stomach drops before your brain catches up, pause there for a second, longer than usual. Don't reach immediately for the apology, the concession, the quick agreement that used to keep you safe. Just pause. That pause, small, almost nothing from the outside, is where you get your reality back.